One day following D-Day, June 7, 1944. 16:20 hours. Omaha Beach, Normandy, is 2 kilometers inland. Dieter Schultz, 16, was crouching in a demolished farmhouse cellar, holding a gun that he hardly knew how to shoot. After 2 days of pandemonium, including the naval bombardment, the Allied landings, and the fall of his unit's defensive position, the Mauser, who was almost as tall as he was, had precisely 3 bullets left. He couldn't understand the American voices calling in English outside, the sounds of methodical clearance, experts securing a position, and boots crunching on debris. Dieter could hardly grasp the weapon due to his trembling hands. He had been trained by the Hitler Youth to fight valiantly to protect the fatherland. Instead, he had been alone and in hiding for 2 days, watching older troops die or escape in terror, knowing nothing but that the Americans were on their way. The propaganda had made it clear that Americans did not take prisoners. After torturing prisoners to extract information, they put them to death. It's better to fight till the very end. For yourself, save the last bullet. Dieter struggled to choose which of the 3 rounds he had left in his gun to use on himself. The door to the cellar flew open. Dust and sunlight streamed in. Huge American soldiers in military uniform with their rifles up were silhouetted in the doorway, screaming, "Don't shoot!" Dieter held up his hands and lowered his rifle. "Avoid shooting!" The Americans stopped. Dieter glimpsed the soldier's face for the first time when he stepped forward and lowered his rifle. The young American, perhaps 22 or 23, had a weary, filthy face that was more shocked than angry. The American said in English, "Jesus Christ." Dieter was unable to comprehend. He is only a child. "Come out, hands up!" a second soldier called down into the cellar. With his hands up, Dieter ascended from the cellar and waited for the promised bullet. He was surrounded by 4 enormous American soldiers who appeared capable of severing his body. When they looked for weapons on him, they only found the Hitler Youth knife that each youngster had been given. Someone other stated something that sounded like a query in English. The first soldier, the one who had referred to him as a child, then took a tin of something out of his knapsack. Sea rations. With a motion to eat, he opened it and gave it to Dieter. Dieter gazed at the tin, the soldier's face, and his own shaking hands as he accepted the food that was being presented to him, more meat and beans than he had seen in 3 days of chaos and fear. He would not be put to death by the Americans. He was being fed by them. Unable to comprehend what was occurring, he ate wolfishly and desperately. According to the propaganda, he would be tortured by Americans. They had fed him instead. With each bite, everything he had been taught was crumbling. With crystal clear clarity, Dieter realized that the truth was saving his life with a can of American rations, while the lies had brought him here to die. Nazi Germany was searching for defenders by June 1944, and there were kids in that barrel. Originally established as a program for ideological indoctrination, the Hitler Youth had been turned into a military reserve. Conscripted into Wehrmacht and SS divisions defending Normandy were boys as young as 14. Before being deployed to defensive positions against the biggest amphibious invasion in history, they had very little training, sometimes just a few days. The desperation was evident from the figures. There were about 20,000 men in the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitler Jugend, most of whom were only 16 or 17 years old. Their average age was 18. 10 to 15,000 of the Normandy defenders were said to have been younger than 18. Hitler Youth soldiers usually received training for 2 to 4 weeks, sometimes even just a few days. They frequently lacked support, ammo, guns, and other essential equipment. According to estimates, between 40 and 60% of young troops died between June and August 1944. These troops weren't exceptional. They were sent against professional Allied forces backed by overwhelming firepower, air supremacy, and logistical dominance after being frightened children and given guns and propaganda. Dieter Schultz had a normal encounter. He was dispatched to Normandy in late May after completing 3 weeks of basic training after being drafted in April 1944 at the age of 16. With orders to repel the assault, his unit, which was composed of elderly reservists and teenage Hitler Youth, manned positions close to Omaha Beach. Within hours, his regiment was completely destroyed by the actual assault. His training had not prepared him for the naval bombardment. Professionals, the American soldiers marching off the beach, moved with skill and firepower that his battalion could not equal. In a 1994 interview, Dieter said, "We were kids with rifles. We sacrificed because Hitler had run out of actual soldiers, even though we were told we were defending the fatherland. Within 2 days, the majority of my unit was either killed or captured. I didn't fight. I only hid to survive. Before Americans discovered me and fed me, I made a significant contribution to the defense of Fortress Europe by cowering in a cellar. Years of Hitler Youth indoctrination had conditioned German adolescent troops to think that American capture would result in torture and death. The messaging was widespread and methodical. Allied violence was a topic of discussion at Hitler Youth sessions. Officers in training recounted alleged crimes against German detainees. Graphic pictures intended to frighten rather than educate were depicted in films and photographs, many of which were fake. The psychological indoctrination was straightforward. Americans are subhuman creatures who will brutally murder you if you are taken prisoner. It's better to fight to the end. This indoctrination was fundamental knowledge to youths who had been part of the Hitler Youth when they were 10 years old. Throughout their early years, they had been taught that Germans were superior, that opponents were malevolent, and that being captured would result in a fate worse than death. These ideas produced real fear when deployed to battle, rendering surrender psychologically hard, even in cases where continuing to fight was suicide. Hans Becker, 15, who was apprehended on June 8 close to Utah Beach, explained his fear. I had heard that Americans would torture detainees to extract information before putting them to death. I was sobbing with fear when my position was overrun and I had to give up. I anticipated being killed, mutilated, and beaten. Rather, I received a chocolate bar and drink from an American soldier. I was unable to comprehend it. Propaganda had been so uncompromising. When an enemy soldier gave me kindness that I had been taught was impossible, I realized it was a lie. Teenage troops were especially hazardous during first contact because of this training. They believed they were battling for existence rather than merely military goals. Thus, they fought with frantic ferocity. However, the propaganda quickly fell apart after being apprehended and shown basic humanity. It was impossible to justify the stark contrast between what was expected, torture and death, and what was really experienced, food and drink. During the early days of D-Day, American forces moving forward from the beaches ran upon pockets of German resistance, including blatantly teenaged individuals. There was an instantaneous and unsettling cognitive contradiction. Despite being minors, some of whom appeared to be just old enough for high school, they needed to be treated as warriors because they were brandishing weapons. After years of fighting Wehrmacht specialists, American soldiers were suddenly up against opponents who were as young as their sons or younger brothers. The 29th Infantry Division Staff Sergeant Robert Mitchell explained his initial experience with adolescent German soldiers. We took fire from a location when we were removing hedgerows close to Vierville. We put an end to it, advanced, and captured 3 Germans as they attempted to flee. They were children. 2 appeared to be 16 or 17 years old. 1 was thin, scared, and crying. The other couldn't have been older than 15. They thought we would shoot them. It was evident in their faces. Rather, we sent them back to the POW pickup site after disarming them and providing them with water. What else should we have done? They were kids. Throughout Normandy, the pattern persisted. Teenage soldiers were among the seized as German defensive positions resisted, were overrun, and surrendered as American forces advanced. The same problem arose with each encounter. These were armed adversaries who had been engaged in conflict, but they were also clearly minors, forced into battle by a desperate government. American reactions were not all the same. Certain units handled adolescent inmates in the same manner as adult prisoners of war, disarming, searching, processing, and relocating to camps. Others provided more food, kinder treatment, and priority medical attention in recognition of the juvenile status of the inmates. Although there was no single policy, a trend did emerge. When feasible, American soldiers avoided killing juveniles, and after they were taken prisoner, they were lenient. Between June and August 1944, American forces apprehended between 150,000 and 200,000 German soldiers. Some of them were as young as 14 and clearly under the age of 18. Ad hoc defensive formations put together in the final desperate weeks of the campaign. Regular Wehrmacht units that had drafted younger soldiers, and Hitler Youth divisions like the 12th SS Panzer were some of the sources of the teenagers. Teens who were captured were handled using the same POW procedure as adult inmates. However, there were practical issues because of their youth. They needed extra medical care. Malnutrition was widespread. The stress of combat was greater. Their psychological susceptibility was greater. Emotional crises resulted from the breakdown of propaganda. They occasionally need protection from adult inmates, who were fervent Nazi officers who threatened young people who assisted with questioning. POW interrogating officer Captain William Hayes explained the difficulty. These German detainees, who were clearly minors, would arrive. Although the regulations stated that they should be treated like any other prisoners of war, in practice, they required particular treatment. A lot of people were undernourished. The majority were traumatized. They had little training, had survived primarily by luck rather than talent, and now faced psychological collapse after realizing that the rhetoric about American violence was untrue. Because they were more likely to lose it than to produce valuable intelligence, we would put their medical needs first, keep them apart from extreme Nazis, and attempt to approach interrogations gently. Their brainwashing was immediately and significantly challenged when they began to get meals from American soldiers. The teenagers frequently experienced extreme hunger. Allied naval interdiction and air supremacy have crippled German supply lines in Normandy. Rations for frontline troops were erratic. Occasionally, they were non-existent for days. Teenage troops were especially affected by food shortages because their bodies were growing and they needed more calories. Many had gone days or weeks without eating enough by the time they were captured. With the most advanced logistics system ever used, American soldiers had plenty of food. Every soldier had their own rations. Supplies were delivered on a regular basis, and units had field kitchens. Americans frequently shared food when taking German prisoners, in part because of military doctrine that demanded compassionate treatment, and in part because individual soldiers saw the prisoners were famished. Receiving food from those alleged monsters immediately destroyed propaganda for German teenagers who had been taught that Americans were subhuman monsters. Later, Dieter Schultz remarked, "I had been told Americans were evil for years. After that, I was apprehended, frightened, and on the verge of death until an American soldier fed me. He handed me his rations after opening them. Everything I had been taught was ruined by that one deed. Why would Americans feed their prisoners if they were monsters? Why waste food if they were going to abuse me?" More than any combat or speech, the chocolate bar the soldier gave me altered my perspective on the conflict. Unquestionably, the propaganda was false. Additional influence was produced by the symbolic meaning of particular foods. American soldiers casually offered chocolate, a luxury that German civilians hadn't experienced in years. Better than German rations, white bread. Plenty of protein and canned meat. The coffee the Germans drank was real, not fake. Every item showed how abundant America was and how eager they were to give it to adversaries they had captured, even if they were teenagers who had been attempting to murder them just hours before. Even more fundamental discrepancies were seen by injured German youth seeking medical care in the United States. These youngsters had been shot, burned, or maimed. Now they were being treated professionally by the adversaries who had taught them that doing so would kill them. The cognitive dissonance was abrupt and intense. Hans Becker, then 15 years old, had been injured by artillery shrapnel during combat close to St. Lo. He attempted to crawl away when American medics discovered him, believing they would kill him. Rather, they flew him to a field hospital for surgery, treated his wounds, administered morphine, and transferred him to an aid post. In a 1989 interview, Hans said simply, "They saved my life. I had been battling them. I would shoot U.S. soldiers. After that, I was hurt and scared, and American medical personnel treated me just as they would their own patients. The procedure was performed expertly. Excellent post-operative care was provided. I recovered without any issues. The surgeon who operated on me had a son my age, I later found out. While his own son was back in America, he had rescued the life of an enemy adolescent. That let me uncover a hidden aspect of American principles that propaganda had concealed. Complex emotions were difficult for American medical staff to manage when caring for juvenile German inmates. Army Nurse Lieutenant Helen Rodriguez recounted, "We'd get these German boys who looked like they should be in high school, not a war. They would be afraid, thinking we would harm them. We would need to comfort them, treat them with kindness, and explain that we were attempting to assist. Some would cry, not because they were hurt, but because they were relieved and perplexed that their foes were rescuing them. It was emotionally taxing. These guys were still children, victims of their own country, even though they had fired at our soldiers. When German teenagers were taken to POW camps, they found conditions that went against Nazi propaganda about the ferocity of the Allies. The camps were professionally run, well-stocked, and well-organized. The regular meals given to prisoners were superior to those they had consumed while serving as German soldiers. Medical treatment was organized. There was enough shelter. Guards preserved order without resorting to regular brutality. The truth was shocking to kids who had anticipated torture camps. Prisoners in American POW camps in Europe consumed between 2,200 and 3,000 calories per day. Regular screenings and treatment for illnesses and injuries were part of medical care. Shelter meant heated tents or weatherproof barracks. Limited schooling and organized sports were examples of recreation. Compared to almost 30% in Soviet camps, the mortality rate was only about 0.15%. Dieter Schultz, when 16, was in an English prisoner of war camp for 14 months. His encounter defied all the predictions of propaganda. He remarked, "We were fed better than I'd eaten in Germany. We received refuge, medical attention, and even some leisure time. The guards weren't mean, they were professional. I finally got enough food in captivity, so I put on weight. In fact, I grew a few inches." I didn't miss the irony. As an enemy prisoner, I was in better health than I had been as a German soldier. Teenage detainees were forced to face the discrepancy between Nazi doctrine and reality in the camps. They could see the organizational skill, financial wealth, and fundamental humanity of Americans. Instead of receiving official re-education, many people experienced direct experience that led them to forsake their Nazi convictions. Hans Becker remarked, "I had time to think." Without continual propaganda support, I spoke with other inmates, including adults who acknowledged the wrongness of the war. I witnessed the fair and courteous treatment we received from Americans. Painfully and slowly, I had to confront the reality. I had struggled against evil. I had learned to tell lies. Americans weren't adversaries. They were the ones who had liberated me from a system that would have resulted in my death for no reason. The disconnect between propaganda and reality caused psychological problems for German teenagers caught during D-Day and the Normandy battle, forcing them to completely reevaluate their views. Sometimes the process was completed within hours of acquisition. Shock came first, followed by perplexity, inquiry, and agonizing reevaluation. Captain Hayes noted, "A German child would enter in fear, certain that we would subject him to torture. We would professionally process him, feed him, and tend to his wounds. The terror would subside in a few days. He would begin to inquire. The philosophy would clearly break down. Many of them had totally given up their Nazi views by the time we put them to permanent camps, not because we re-educated them, but rather because we treated them with compassion. Whole lives were molded by these encounters. Americans' acts of kindness at those times of vulnerability shaped attitudes and memories that persisted for decades. When German teenagers were first permitted to write home, they wrote about fair treatment, food, and care. Words of relief and incredulity were exchanged with families who had been expecting death or torture. In August 1944, Dieter wrote from England, "I am alive and healthy. I've been treated properly and fed well by the Americans. Propaganda was used to tell us about their savagery. Don't trust anything you hear on the radio, please." The fact that her kid was still alive and that the enemy had spared him overwhelmed his mother, who lived in destroyed Hamburg. She told her neighbors about the letter. Doubt grew. What else could be lies if the way Americans treated prisoners was humane? As the number of these letters increased, Nazi credibility was subtly destroyed. Sons were more trusted by families than propaganda. Handwritten truth spreads more quickly than official lies. The encounter caused long-lasting moral difficulties for American soldiers who had fought and captured German youngsters. Many felt guilty about the deaths of youngsters in combat. Mercy brought comfort to others. "I am unable to reconcile with the murder," Sergeant Mitchell declared. "However, I'm happy that we extended mercy when we could." The post-war policy was shaped by the memories of battling children. In order to ensure that no generation would ever be utilized in such a manner again, the U.S. occupation outlawed the Hitler Youth and imposed demilitarization. Teenage German captives were reshaped by mercy when they were eventually allowed to return home. Dieter Schultz returned home to ruins, but he was alive, well, and changed. He claimed that when his mother saw me, she started crying. We were warned that the enemy would murder us. Rather, they sent me home in better health than when I arrived. Everything that followed was determined by that paradox. A generation of former adolescent soldiers remembered and propagated American kindness. Hans Becker claimed, "I attempted to kill Americans while I was a child soldier. I could have been killed by them. They saved me instead." I learned the definition of civilization from that mercy. I have dedicated my life to teaching that peace is always preferable to battle, that mercy is power, and that propaganda is false. The narrative exposed a reality regarding propaganda, conflict, and people. Children can be led to believe that opponents are monsters by propaganda until those enemies provide food rather than weapons. Yes, force was used to win the war. However, American soldiers' decisions to feed starving enemy children rather than allowing them to starve were the foundation of peace. Retaliation would have destroyed the opportunities that mercy generated. German youths were supposed to perish on the beaches of Normandy. but American soldiers showed that people can live despite the horrors of war. Instead of killing children, they decided to feed them, even when those kids were dressed as the enemy, even hours before when they had been attempting to murder them.